In the introduction to his book, The Hacking of the American Mind, Dr. Robert Lustig quotes John Butler Yeats, who said to his son William, "Happiness is neither virtue nor pleasure, nor this thing nor that, but simply growth. We are happy when we are growing." Lustig says philosophers have known this for thousands of years, yet today the systemic confusion and conflation of the concepts and definitions of pleasure and happiness have been inserted into the limbic system. That's the emotional part of our brains. The consequence of the assault on our brains is a slow motion crash of millions of lives. A crash, Lustig says, was intentional. He says the business community and governments have taken advantage of neuroscience that lays out the difference between pleasure and happiness and how they influence each other. Lustig says they have hacked our decision-making capacity and in doing so have altered our individual and cultural well-being. I invited Dr. Robert Lustig, the author of The Hacking of the American Mind, to join me for a conversation that matters about how you've been manipulated into believing you can be happy by buying pleasure. Dr. Lustig, welcome. Is that really the case that we have been duped into believing that through the purchasing of pleasure, we can actually be happy?
So first you have to understand the definitions of the two words. And I'm going to make it very clear. Pleasure and happiness are not the same. So let me explain to you the difference between pleasure and happiness. Sounds kind of stupid, but let me do it. It's very simple. Pleasure is the positive emotion that says, this feels good, I want more. Happiness is the positive emotion that says, this feels good, I don't want or need any more. Now, they are not the same. Now, pleasure and happiness, in my book, have 7 cardinal differences between them. And let me lay them out to you so that you can compare them to how you think about it. Number 1, pleasure is short-lived, like a meal. Happiness is long-lived, a lifetime. 2, pleasure is visceral. You feel it in your body. Happiness is ethereal. You feel it above the neck. Number 3, pleasure is taking, like from a casino. Happiness is giving, like to Habitat for Humanity. Number 4, pleasure is experienced alone. Number 5, pleasure can be achieved with substances, like cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol, sugar. Happiness cannot be achieved with substances. Number 6, the extremes of pleasure, whether they be substances or behaviors. So all those substances I just mentioned, plus gambling, shopping, internet gaming, social media, pornography. In the extreme, all lead to addiction. There's an aholic after every one of those. Shopaholic, sexaholic, chocoholic, alcoholic, etc. But there's no such thing as being addicted to too much happiness. And finally, number 7, the reason I wrote the book, pleasure is dopamine and happiness is serotonin. 2 different neurotransmitters, 2 different areas of the brain, 2 different sets of receptors, 2 different regulatory mechanisms. They are not the same. You might say to me, Mr. McNish, like, so what? Who cares? Big deal. They both feel good. I want both. Well, it actually matters a lot. And the reason it matters is the following. Dopamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It excites the next neuron. And there's an area of the brain that receives that dopamine signal. We call it the reward center. It's got a name. It's called the nucleus accumbens. It's an actual place right there in your head. And the nucleus accumbens has dopamine receptors. And those receptors transduce that signal. And we feel that as motivation, reward, pleasure. And we love that. So dopamine is essential for the human race. It's essential for progress. It's essential for being able to do a full day's work. It's essential for a whole bunch of things. However, dopamine, because it's an excitatory neurotransmitter, Excitatory neurotransmitters, when released chronically, actually cause cell death. Every single neurotransmitter that is excitatory in the extreme and chronically will ultimately kill the next neuron. Now, the neuron doesn't want to be killed, so it has a plan B. It has a fail-safe. What it does is it downregulates, reduces the number of dopamine receptors. And what that means physiologically is the more you seek, the less you get. It's the phenomenon of tolerance. It's the law of diminishing returns. And that is what people who are addicted will tell you immediately is they have to up and up and up their substance of choice, and they get less and less and less pennies for it. And when the neurons actually do start to die, they don't come back. And that's addiction. Now, as it turns out, happiness, serotonin, contentment, that's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. That actually inhibits the next neuron from firing. So do you need to downregulate those receptors? No cell death involved. So you can't overdose on too much happiness. But there's one thing that downregulates that serotonin, dopamine. The more pleasure you seek, the less happy you get. And we have been chasing pleasure as the cure for our unhappiness because we've been told by the food industry, the oil industry, the pharma industry, and a whole host of other industries while we're at it, that if you buy this, you will be happy.
The social media industry also plays on that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, sorry, I left that one out. Perhaps the most important.
Is it, or is food the most important one? Because you talk about our brains and the way that we function. Our brain requires glucose to be able to be fed appropriately, and if I can have an immediate hit of energy because I have consumed something that's very low on the glycemic index or very high on the glycemic index, do I have that right? Low on the glycemic index, a quick hit. Am I then not? Yeah.
Well, so the point is that this phenomenon that I am talking about is actually unrelated to glycemic index.
Okay.
So glycemic index is how high, for your audience, glycemic index is how high does your blood glucose rise when you eat 50 grams of carbohydrate in any specific food. So white bread, your blood glucose goes way high.
Yeah.
Carrots have glucose in them, but carrots have fiber, and so the fiber actually inhibits the absorption. So in order to get the same glucose rise, you'd have to eat, 1.4 pounds of carrots to get 50 grams of carbohydrate. You'd have to eat the whole friggin' Grimway truck. Nobody could do it. So glycemic index is not the issue because this is actually not about glucose. This is about the other molecule in sugar. The sugar is not one molecule, it's two, right? And they're bound together, these two molecules. One's glucose, the one you've been talking about, but then there's this other one, and it's called fructose. Fructose is not glucose. Fructose is the sweet molecule in sugar. Glucose isn't all that interesting. Glucose is minimally sweet. It's like molasses. Okay, that's glucose. Yeah, you see anybody going around chugging molasses? I don't think so. Right? Fructose is inherently sweet. Fructose is the molecule we seek. And it turns out fructose, for lack of a better word, is addictive. It stimulates that reward center, that nucleus accumbens. Glucose doesn't. So fructose is the reason why we all love sugar, why we can't resist sugar, is that molecule fructose, not the glucose. And so that is specific to sugar, not to starch, because starch doesn't have fructose. Sugar, fructose. Now wait, let me just finish this, because this is super important that you understand this concept. People think, oh, fructose is a sugar, fructose is energy, gives you a boost. Wrong. Got that wrong. Turns out fructose It is energy if you blow it up in a bomb calorimeter. It's 4 calories per gram, just like glucose and just like protein. But it turns out that fructose, because of its unique biochemistry, actually poisons the mitochondria of your cells and the mitochondria of your brain. So the mitochondria are the little energy burning factories that actually make the chemical energy called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, that powers your neurons, powers your cells, powers your heart, powers your liver, powers your muscles, powers every single thing that goes on in your body. And fructose actually inhibits their functioning. It inhibits 3 separate enzymes that actually inhibit your ability to generate more ATP. So fructose is not a boost of energy. Fructose is actually the opposite. It is actually an inhibitor of energy. It is, for lack of a better word, a poison. Because the other thing that causes your mitochondria to not work right is cyanide.
Okay. Do we not see fructose in virtually all prepackaged foods these days?
We do. And the reason is because the food industry put it there. And the reason they put it there is because it would taste like crap if they didn't. Fructose is the hook. It's the thing that gets you to buy more. And the food industry knows that when they add it, you do buy more, which is why the sugar content of virtually every food that you can buy in the supermarket that has a logo, the sugar content's been going up and up and up and up over the course of the last 40 years. As the food industry learned this, and they had to learn it because we went low fat and the food tasted like cardboard. So they had to do something to make the food palatable. And they learned when they added more sugar, guess what? You bought more.
Were we sold a bill of goods when we were told that fat was the culprit? We had to go low fat. And did the food industry know that they were pushing us in the wrong direction?
Yes, we do now know that they knew. At the time, we didn't know. At the time, it seemed like, well, it made the most sense because we had learned in the 1970s that this particle in our bloodstream called LDL, low density lipoprotein, we learned that that was correlated with heart disease. Now, that's true. It's still true. It's correlated weakly. The hazard risk ratio for high LDL and heart disease is 1.3, meaning if you have a high LDL, you have a 30% greater risk of having a heart attack. Okay, that's real. I'm not arguing that. That's real. Well, because of that, we said, oh, we got to get the LDL down. Because if we get the LDL down, then we'll stop heart attacks. And so in order to do that, they said, well, we got to get rid of the saturated fat because the saturated fat is what makes the LDL go up. And that's true. Saturated fat does make LDL go up. And I don't argue that. But it turns out there's something way more important than LDL in terms of heart attacks. And it's called triglyceride. So that's the other lipid that's on your lipid profile when you go to the doctor. And everyone ignored that one. Everyone ignored triglyceride. And there's a reason we ignored it at the time. And the reason is because a lot of people weren't fasting when they got their labs drawn. And if you're not fasting, then you can't measure triglyceride accurately. That's true. Whereas LDL doesn't change nearly as much. So you could measure it on non-fasting specimens. And in the 1980s, guess what? We had a drug for LDL, statins. Whereas we didn't have a drug for triglycerides. Turns out triglycerides have a hazard risk ratio of 1.8 for heart disease. So if you have a high triglyceride, you have an 80% increased risk of dying of a heart attack. So LDL, 1.3, triglycerides, 1.8. So triglyceride, way worse than LDL. Well, guess what makes the triglycerides? Sugar, not saturated fat. So we took the saturated fat out of the diet to lower the LDL, had to replace it with something to make the food palatable, and raised our triglycerides. And why do you think we have more heart disease? And now also more diabetes? Because guess what? We're poisoning our mitochondria. And that's generating a phenomenon called insulin resistance. And that's burning out our pancreases. In other words, we robbed Peter to pay Paul, and now we're paying the piper.
So that's the food industry. We talked about social media ever so briefly. You also say governments are hacking our mind by understanding how to fire off those pleasure centers.
Indeed.
It's like this is throughout our lives on multiple levels that we have to be paying attention to how we are responding to what would be a momentary response for something that's pleasure versus building happiness. How do we start to work to find a better stasis?
That's a really good question, and it ain't easy,
No.
to say the least. But there's something else that's been thrown into the mix that's made this much, much, much worse. Okay, so yes, dopamine's a good guy and a bad guy. Serotonin is mostly a good guy. We got that. But there's another piece to the puzzle that we haven't talked about yet. And it's a hormone. It's made by your adrenal gland. And it's called cortisol. Cortisol is our stress hormone. And what cortisol does is it preps our body for, stress, whether it be physical or mental, and that's good. But what it also does is it takes the thinking part of our brain right behind our forehead, right here, which is known as the prefrontal cortex, the executive function center of our brain, the part of your brain that keeps you from doing stupid things. And it just takes it virtually offline. And when your prefrontal cortex goes offline, your reward center becomes completely disinhibited. And so it's not just saying, this feels good, I want more. It is now saying, this feels way good and I need more. And that's where addiction comes in. So the combination of both dopamine and cortisol has taken us from thinking rational, prefrontal cortical competent human beings to basically hedonic, live for the moment, no thought whatsoever lizards. And that is the combination of the two. And what does dopamine and cortisol together? Social media.
Because life is complex, there is no easy answer, but there must be things that we as individuals can do to safeguard being manipulated this way by such external forces.
Indeed. So the bottom line is we gotta get the dopamine down, we gotta get the cortisol down, and we gotta get the serotonin up. That's the formula. Now, how do you do that? Especially when you're being bombarded nonstop with all of this external messaging telling you to buy this and eat that and do this in terms of behavior. And you watch what happens on TV. It's it's basically Jerry Springer every single day, whether it be entertainment or politics. That's what we've got. That's the current environment we live in. Nonstop dopamine and cortisol. How do you turn that off? In my book, The Hacking of the American Mind, I mention 4 things that do all 3. I call them the 4 C's in the book. 4 C's. Every one of them starts with a C. And the best part of those 4 C's is every single one of them is free. Number 1, connect. And that does not mean Facebook. That means face-to-face, eye-to-eye connection. Now, I will tell you, one of the reasons things have gotten much worse is because we don't have face-to-face, eye-to-eye connection for the past 2 years because of the pandemic.
Right.
So why do you have to connect and why does it have to be in person? Because when you do it in person, you are reading the emotions of the person you're talking to. The back of your brain, the occipital lobe of your brain is actually reading the emotions of the person you're conversing with. And that emotion is being transferred from that person to you through serotonin. This process of taking on other people's emotions, we have a name for it. It's called empathy. And it has been shown that the pandemic has basically cut empathy by 40%. Now, that empathy is serotonin. That's what makes people feel like human beings. Number 2, contribute. And contribute does not mean to your 401k. Okay, doing that which creates greater good in the world makes you feel like you're part of something, part of the bigger whole. That's serotonin. Yeah, some people get through religion, and that's okay. Some people will get it through, clubs or, whatever. There are a lot of ways to do it. Number 3, cope. And cope means 3 things: sleep, mindfulness, and exercise. So sleep is a necessary rejuvenator of serotonin. When you are sleep deprived, your serotonin goes way down, your dopamine goes up, by the way, and your cortisol goes up, and your ghrelin, which is your hunger hormone, goes up. Okay, and so that's a real problem. And caffeine, to stay awake, is a bigger problem because it's going to deplete serotonin because it's inhibiting adenosine receptors. And then finally, number 4 of the 4 C's, cook. Because there are 3 things, 3 items in food, 3 specific chemicals in food that matter. Tryptophan. Tryptophan is the precursor to serotonin, and tryptophan is the rarest amino acid. It is found in eggs, poultry, fish, not exactly processed food. Omega-3s, again, in eggs and fish, and maybe a little flax. But again, not exactly processed food. And finally, reducing fructose, reducing sugar. So what you want is a high tryptophan, high omega-3, low sugar diet. That's called real food.
You can only make that yourself. You can't buy it in a box.
That's right. If it's in a box, it is processed, and that would be a low tryptophan, low omega-3, high sugar diet. That's called processed food.
Well, I think that those are really important factors in helping each of us be better decision makers, because every time we make a decision about something, it affects future outcomes, and how we're able to think our way through what's coming at us and what we're experiencing, I think plays a big part in the quality of our lives.
Indeed. I couldn't agree more.